They say a house never forgets the tragedies that happen within its walls. For years, Marvin Gaye's former home stood quietly in Los Angeles, a modest place compared to the mansions of other stars. On the outside, it looked ordinary stucco walls, a quiet street, a tall hedge that shielded it from curious eyes. But inside, the air felt heavy. Visitors often described it as too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The story begins with a couple who bought the house decades after Gaye's tragic death. They didn't know much about the history at first, just that the house once belonged to a famous singer. But the first night they slept there, the silence was broken by a sound neither of them could explain. Muffled music drifting through the vents. At first, they thought it was a neighbor playing old soul records. But when the husband pressed his ear to the wall, he swore the sound was inside the house. It wasn't just any music either. It was Marvin Gaye's voice, warm, sorrowful, and impossibly clear. The song seemed to come from nowhere, echoing faintly as if the house itself was humming. And just when they leaned closer, straining to hear, it would cut off abrupt, like someone pulling the plug. The days that followed only deepened the mystery. The stereo in the living room, unplugged and unused, would click on at 3:15 every morning, its display glowing faintly before shutting down again. One evening, the wife found the curtains drawn back in the bedroom they had left locked. The window was cracked open, and outside on the lawn lay a single vinyl record, warped and weathered. What's going on? Neither of them owned it. Neighbors started to whisper. Some had lived on the block long enough to remember the police cars that once filled the street, the day Marvin Gaye was killed by his father inside that very home. They warned the new owners in hushed voices, that place carries pain. But the couple stayed, and soon the house began to turn on them. The wife woke to the faint smell of gunpowder in the hallway. The husband swore he saw a figure tall, broad-shouldered, head bowed standing at the end of the corridor. But when he blinked, it vanished, leaving only the creak of the floorboards and a lingering chill. By then, they knew. This wasn't just a house. It was a mausoleum of memories, replaying the final moments of one of music's greatest voices. And the deeper they dug into its history, the more they realized that whatever haunted Marvin Gaye's home wasn't ready to be silenced. The couple began to avoid certain rooms. The den, where a faint vibration could sometimes be felt in the floorboards, became unbearable at night. The husband described it as if a speaker buried deep beneath the wood was humming a single low note constant, trembling, like a bass line only the body could hear. It made his teeth ache, made his chest feel tight. And yet, when he placed his ear against the boards, there was nothing, just silence. The wife noticed the mirrors first. They were ordinary mirrors, framed in dark wood, a little worn around the edges. But whenever she passed one in the dim evening light, she thought she caught movement that didn't belong to her reflection. A hand brushing through hair, shoulders slumping forward in grief, a silhouette leaning closer to the glass, its features lost in shadow. She tried to dismiss it, tricks of light, tired eyes. But one night, when she reached to wipe condensation from the bathroom mirror, she froze. The words "Father, why?" had been traced into the fogged glass. Her hands were dry. She hadn't written it. The house began to alter its mood depending on the day. Afternoons were eerily calm, sometimes even pleasant, as sunlight spilled through the windows and softened the corners of the rooms. But once darkness fell, the weight in the air grew almost unbearable. The couple said it felt like living inside a held breath, every creak of the wood, every gust of wind pressing harder against their nerves. Sleep became impossible. The husband began to wander the halls late at night, guided by sounds he couldn't ignore, faint footsteps moving ahead of him, always just out of sight. Once, he followed them to the narrow hallway that led to the master bedroom. The air there was heavy, suffocating, like the humidity of a storm pressing against his skin. He pushed open the door, and though the room was empty, he swore the curtains swayed as if someone had just walked past them. The wife grew pale, restless, snapping at shadows, flinching at the smallest sounds. She told her husband she kept hearing a man's voice whispering behind her when she washed dishes. A voice she couldn't quite make out, but that carried a tone of pleading. Sometimes she would turn the faucet off just to listen, and the kitchen would fall into a silence so complete it made her stomach twist. Then, just when she thought she had imagined it, she would hear it again, softer this time, right at her ear. Even the neighbors began to notice. They told the couple that late at night, when the house was dark, they sometimes heard music drifting from its walls. Not loud, not clear, just a sad, fragmented tune, like someone practicing a song they couldn't finish. Some even claimed they saw a figure silhouetted at the upstairs window, standing very still with its head bowed, as if listening for something. The couple stopped inviting friends over. The few who visited didn't stay long. One woman, after stepping inside, whispered that the house felt like it's holding its breath. Another guest complained of a sudden headache the moment she entered the den, as if the air was pressing against her skull. The breaking point came one night when the wife woke to the sound of crying low, guttural sobs that seemed to fill the entire house. She shook her husband awake, and together they followed the sound down the hall. It led them straight to the living room. The stereo, the one they had left unplugged for weeks, was glowing faintly. And though no record spun, no disc played, Marvin Gaye's voice drifted from the speaker's soft, cracked, almost whispering, "Trouble man." The husband lunged forward, yanking the cord from the wall, but the music didn't stop. It grew louder, filling the room with a sorrow so raw that both of them stood frozen, unable to speak. The wife swore she felt a hand brush across her back. Not hostile, but desperate, like someone reaching out through the air. Then, just as suddenly, the music cut off, the stereo dead, the house silent again. They didn't sleep that night. They didn't even sit. They stayed in the kitchen, the lights on, the windows cracked open, trying to breathe in anything but the stale heaviness of the house. Both of them knew, without speaking, that the place wasn't just haunted, it was repeating something. A cycle of pain, of final moments, of unfinished songs echoing inside walls that would never let go. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The nights began to blur together. Neither of them could remember the last time they had truly slept. The husband tried moving a small mattress into the living room, hoping the change of space might help. But the moment he lay down, the air turned thick, pressing against his lungs. He could hear it again, the faint hum through the floorboards, like a heartbeat slowed to an unnatural rhythm. He sat up, the sweat already clinging to his skin, and whispered to his wife that he felt as though the house itself was breathing beneath him. The wife had grown quieter with each passing day. She no longer argued with him about leaving lights on or wasting electricity. Every room burned bright from dusk until dawn. Yet even the glow of lamps couldn't soften the strange atmosphere. She found herself avoiding her own reflection, covering the bathroom mirror with a towel, refusing to look into the glass at night. But sometimes, even without mirrors, she would catch glimpses of things. A figure at the end of the hallway that melted into shadow when she blinked. A hand sliding along the banister just ahead of hers. A sudden movement in the corner of her vision that left her too afraid to turn her head. They began to notice a pattern. The disturbances seemed to intensify near one room, the master bedroom. At first, it was only small things. The smell of cigarette smoke lingering there without reason. The faint creak of the bed frame in the middle of the night, though no one had touched it. The curtains, always drawn back by morning no matter how tightly they closed them. But one evening, while sorting through boxes in the hallway, the wife heard what she swore was the muffled sound of a man's voice on the other side of the bedroom door. A deep, broken sound, as though someone was praying. She pressed her ear against the wood, and though she couldn't make out the words, she could feel the sorrow in them. By the time her husband came to check, the room was silent again. The husband's experiences became more physical. Twice, he woke to the sensation of someone gripping his wrist so tightly it ached, though nothing was there when he opened his eyes. Another time, while standing at the kitchen sink, he felt a sudden shove at his back, hard enough to make him stumble forward into the counter. He spun around, furious, but the room was empty. His wife, pale and shaking, said she had been sitting at the table the whole time and hadn't moved. One night, after another long stretch of restless silence, They both heard it clearly. The slam of a door upstairs. Not the settling of wood. Not a draft, but a forceful, deliberate slam. They froze, staring at each other, their nerves stretched thin. Against his better judgment, the husband grabbed a flashlight and went up alone. Each step groaned beneath his weight, echoing far too loudly. The upstairs hallway felt colder, heavier, as though the air had thickened. The master bedroom door, the one they always kept open, was shut tight. When he reached for the handle, it felt warm, almost feverish. He hesitated, then pushed it open. The room beyond looked untouched, but the curtains were swaying gently as if someone had just walked past them. His flashlight beam skimmed across the bed, and that's when he saw it, a single, fresh indentation pressed into the mattress. The shape of a body lying there, though no one had been in that bed for weeks. His chest tightened. He whispered his wife's name, but his voice broke into the silence. When he blinked again, the indentation was gone, the sheets smooth, as though the bed had never been disturbed. They began to understand the truth neither wanted to say aloud. They were not alone in that house, and whatever was there wasn't random. It was replaying something, a fragment of anguish so deep it had fused with the walls. The husband found himself pacing at night, almost unconsciously, tracing the same route through the house over and over. From the hallway to the bedroom, back to the living room, and then to the front door where he'd stop, staring at the lock, his hand hovering as though tempted to leave but unable to turn the knob. His wife once caught him standing there, motionless, whispering under his breath. When she asked what he was saying, he looked at her with hollow eyes and swore he hadn't spoken at all. Neighbors noticed the change in them. Their faces grew pale, sleepless. They no longer waved, no longer watered the front yard or collected the mail promptly. A deliverman later told a neighbor that when he dropped off a package, he thought he heard music seeping from inside, low, mournful, unmistakably Marvin Gaye's voice, as though someone was playing a record too quietly for the human ear but loud enough for the house itself to absorb. And then came the night when the wife finally saw him. She had woken around 3 in the morning, restless, her body aching from exhaustion. The house was silent, the kind of silence that made her skin crawl. She sat up, and in the dim light spilling through the half-drawn curtains, she saw him. A tall man, shoulders hunched, head bowed, standing in the corner of the bedroom. His outline was blurred, shadow bleeding into shadow, but she could feel his sorrow radiating across the room. She gasped, clutching at the sheets, but the figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, as if reliving a moment only he could see. When she blinked, he was gone. She didn't scream. She didn't tell her husband right away. But when morning came, her eyes were swollen from tears she hadn't realized she'd cried. And for the first time, she whispered what had been sitting at the edge of her thoughts for weeks. "This house, it doesn't want us. It wants him." The wife's words lingered between them like smoke. It wants him. Neither of them spoke of it again, but both knew she was right. The house wasn't simply haunted, it was obsessed, wrapped around the memory of a man who had met his end too violently, too suddenly, in its very rooms. The days grew disjointed. The husband stopped shaving, his beard coming in patchy and rough, his eyes sunken. He drifted through the house as though pulled along invisible tracks, walking from room to room without reason, always pausing longest in the master bedroom doorway. The wife grew brittle, her hands trembling when she folded laundry, her movements sharp and restless. She started humming unconsciously soft, broken notes that she swore weren't hers. The tunes were unfamiliar to her, but unmistakably soulful. When her husband asked what she was humming, she stared at him blankly, insisting she hadn't made a sound. At night, the house grew louder. Floorboards cracked like gunshots. Doors groaned open, slow and deliberate, as if someone unseen were moving through the halls. And always, beneath it all, the music. Not full songs, not clear melodies, just fragments. A single line of "Let's Get It On" whispered from the far corner of a room. A sighing hum of "Mercy, Mercy Me" drifting faintly from the vents. They tried to convince themselves it was their imaginations, but both heard it, often at the same time, often in different rooms. The master bedroom became impossible to ignore. Some nights, the wife swore she felt heat radiating from behind its door, as though a furnace had been lit within. Other nights, the husband claimed it was ice cold, his breath fogging faintly as he stepped inside. Objects began to move there too. A lampshade turned slightly off-center, a drawer cracked open that had been firmly closed. And once, most disturbingly, the bedspread was dragged halfway to the floor, as though someone had risen violently in the middle of the night. The wife began dreaming of a man's voice calling her name, not her own name, but a name she didn't recognize. Each time she woke, the syllables dissolved on her tongue, but the feeling lingered, deep sadness, a plea that she could not answer. When she told her husband, his face drained of color. He confessed that he too had heard a voice in his sleep, not calling a name, but whispering again and again, why? The tension finally broke one early morning, just as the sky was paling. They had dozed fitfully on the couch, too afraid to go upstairs. A sudden crash woke them both. It wasn't a subtle sound this time, not a creak or a whisper, but a violent shattering. They ran to the hallway and found a framed photograph of Marvin Gaye, the one the husband had purchased from a record shop and hung near the den, smashed on the floor. The glass was shattered, the frame splintered, but the strangest thing was the wall itself. The nail it had hung on was bent, twisted as if pulled from the inside of the wall outward. The wife fell to her knees, staring at the broken portrait. The husband bent to pick it up, but stopped halfway. In the shards of glass, he swore he saw a reflection that wasn't his own. A man with heavy eyes, his mouth half open in anguish, staring back at him. He dropped the frame instantly, the shards scattering farther across the floor. From that night on, the house grew openly hostile. Lights flickered violently, plunging them into darkness at the worst possible moments. The stereo, long unplugged, roared to life in the middle of the night, blasting distorted fragments of music until the husband yanked the cord from the wall with shaking hands. Doors slammed so hard the windows rattled in their frames. The wife woke more than once to the sound of footsteps rushing down the hallway straight toward the couch, only for the noise to stop inches away from her head. And yet, beneath the fear, something else was growing. A terrible, gnawing sadness. The wife began to cry without warning, sobbing at the kitchen sink with no reason she could explain. The husband, once steady, found himself trembling with rage at the smallest things, slamming his fists against the counter, his voice cracking with anger he couldn't control. It was as though the house wasn't only haunting them, it was reshaping them, pulling them into the same emotional chaos that had once filled its walls. The neighbors noticed. A woman across the street told her husband she saw the couple standing in their driveway at 3 in the morning, both staring blankly at the house as if it were speaking to them. Another neighbor swore he heard the sound of a man shouting from inside late one night, furious, desperate words, but when he looked out his window, the house was dark, silent, still. Inside, the wife began to believe they were no longer just witnesses. They were participants. She told her husband, her voice cracking, that she felt the tragedy replaying itself through them, that the house wasn't simply showing them echoes, but using them to relive a moment it could never let go of. The husband didn't argue. He only stared at the master bedroom door, his jaw tight, his hands trembling. And in the silence that followed, they both heard it, two sharp sounds, muffled but unmistakable. Gunshots. The sound of gunfire echoed through the house, dull and distant at first, like thunder muffled by thick walls. The wife clutched her chest, frozen in place. The husband's legs carried him forward without thought, toward the master bedroom door, as though he had no choice in the matter. Each step felt heavier, like walking into water. The door was already ajar. A faint light flickered from within, though no lamps had been switched on. As he pushed it open, the wife trailing behind him, the air inside was suffocating. The room was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder, sharp and undeniable, as though a shot had just been fired. And then they saw it. The room was not the empty bedroom they had lived with for months. It was transformed, pulled backward in time. The furniture had shifted, the bedspread replaced with one neither of them recognized, the curtains drawn tightly shut. And there, at the far end of the room, was the outline of a man. Shoulders broad, head bowed, his presence heavy with sorrow. He was not solid, not fully formed. His edges seemed to shimmer, blur, fade. But his grief filled every corner of the space. The wife gasped, tears welling instantly. The husband took a step forward, but the figure lifted its head slowly, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. The sadness in that gaze was unbearable, raw, unending. And then came the second gunshot. The sound cracked through the air, deafening, reverberating in their skulls. The wife screamed, covering her ears, but the husband swore he felt the bullet pass through him, a wave of heat and pressure that stole the breath from his lungs. The figure staggered, collapsing to the floor, dissolving into shadow even as it fell. The room went black. When the light returned just a blink later, the room was as it had always been. Empty, quiet, the bedspread neatly tucked, the curtains hanging limp. But the smell lingered, faint smoke curling into their nostrils. Impossible to deny. They fled the room, slamming the door behind them. They did not speak that night. They did not sleep. They sat in the kitchen, pale and trembling, waiting for dawn. By morning, the decision was made without words. They packed what they could fit into their car and left. Neighbors watched them pull away, their faces blank, eyes hollow, as if they were leaving behind more than just a house. The home stood empty for months, then years. Realtors struggled to keep it on the market. Interested buyers would step inside, walk through its hallways, and leave quickly, shaking their heads, unable to explain why the place felt so wrong. One man reportedly refused to cross the threshold altogether, claiming he heard a voice humming just beyond the doorway. Today, the house still stands. From the outside, it looks like any other home on the block, modest, unassuming, its windows catching the California sun. But those who live nearby know better. They say that some nights, if the street is quiet enough, you can hear it again. A voice drifting through the air, soft and broken, singing fragments of songs that never seem to end. And if you linger too long, staring at the upstairs window, you might see him. A tall figure, shoulders slumped, head bowed, still trapped in the moment that took everything from him. Marvin Gaye's house never forgot, and it never let go. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.